Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 712 of the Juicebox Podcast. This is the second part of a special Bold Beginnings episode. Part 1 is already available at episode 711. Welcome back to the Bold Beginnings series with me and Jenny Smith. Today's two-parter happens in episodes 711 and 712. This is Bold Beginnings Terminology Part 2. In these two episodes, Jenny and I define every word that's available to you in the Defining Diabetes series. At the time of this recording, there were over 40 definitions. We did a quick definition for newly diagnosed people and left you the episode numbers so you can go back and get a more complete definition. If you've just been diagnosed, or if you're trying to figure things out, it is our estimation that this two-part episode, part of the Bold Beginnings series, will catch you up on terminology very quickly. If you're looking for the Defining Diabetes series, it's available at juiceboxpodcast.com, diabetesprotip.com, and in any audio app that you listen in. Join the Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes, to find the lists of all the series in the featured section. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by InPen from Medtronic Diabetes. And because of the format of this episode, I'm going to put the ad right here for you so that you don't have to take a break while you're power listening through these definitions. Isn't that cool of InPen to let that happen? Thank you, InPen. Even though I didn't ask you, but I know you're listening, so just be cool, all right? All right, ready? The InPen. It's an insulin pen, but it's more than that because it's attached to an application on your iPhone or Android phone. This application is going to do many of the things that you've heard about people getting from their insulin pumps. You'll be able to see your current glucose right on the screen, a dosing calculator, active insulin remaining, meal history, dose history, glucose history, activity logs, and you can generate reports based on your data. Not only that, but you're getting a great insulin pen. Everything you expect. The cap, the needle, the insulin cartridge holder, it's an insulin pen, just like you've come to expect, but it gives you more with its attached app. You can go right now to InPenToday.com to find out more and get started. And I'm going to tell you what, terms and conditions apply, but you may pay as little as $35 for the InPen. Medtronic Diabetes does not want cost to be a roadblock to you getting the therapy that you need. With InPen's Access program, you may pay as little as $35. Where will you find that out? At InPenToday.com. On this site, tons of frequently asked questions that you're going to be interested in. Just scroll to the bottom. What is the InPen? How much does it cost? Are insulin cartridges included? Does InPen work with long-acting insulin? Can I pair more than one InPen to an app? You want to know the answers to those questions? Go right now to InPenToday.com and get your answer. If you're ready to try the InPen, when you're at the link, just follow the easy instructions. It says, ready to try. You complete a short form, and just like that, you're on your way. InPenToday.com/juicebox. InPen requires a prescription and settings from your healthcare provider. You must use proper settings and follow the instructions as directed, or you could experience high or low glucose levels. For more safety information, visit InPenToday.com.
Yeah.
Okay.
Haha, there it is.
So Jenny and I are back. This is another day. We recorded from bolus to feeding insulin, and now we're going to go to episode 347 in the Defining Diabetes series. This is another made up. I think this is one of the last ones that I made up for a while. Yeah, it is. But this one's called Bump and Nudge. So, you know what, Jenny, I've described how I think of it all the time, but you've heard me talk about it so much. How do you think about it now that I've explained it to you?
Well, it's just, I just think it's learning how to use insulin better to bring your blood sugar into the place that you want it to, as well as not only insulin, but food, right? Because it's kind of it's a both system. You use insulin to get your blood sugar to come down to where you want it to. And if you maybe use just a little bit too much, then you're using a little bit of food to kind of keep it stable and avoid it from dropping too low. So
there's been this, there was once a discussion online where people said, do you think of, somebody asked me one time, do you think of bumping as insulin or bumping as carbs? And everybody had, because I've never really said it before, but in my mind, I nudge with food and bump with insulin, I think.
See, and I'm the opposite.
Yeah, you think of it the other way. It doesn't really matter. The
No.
way, in 20 seconds, the way I describe it to people is when you're driving in a lane and there's a line on your right, a line on your left. If you start to slowly drift towards the line, you don't quickly yank the wheel back the other way. You just sort of bring it back just ever so slightly to come back into tow again, right? To be straight again. So
Yes.
instead of waiting till your blood sugar 60 and falling, what if when it was 85 and it was just sort of drifting down, if you just had a couple of carbs, if you just sort of nudged it back up again or bumped it back up again, it really doesn't matter which one strikes you in your mind. And similarly, why not lower your CGM alarm to more like 120 so that when you're kind of drifting up gently, you could give a small amount of insulin and bump that number back down, because a lot of times less insulin gives you less of a chance of a low later. So just instead of waiting till you're instead of waiting till you're off the road in the weeds and bouncing through the holes, when you see the line, just sort of come back a little bit, bumping and nudging. It's really the whole thing. So that's episode 347. And Jenny, episode 352 is Rage Bolus. Go ahead, do Rage Bolus.
Yeah, Rage Bolus. Everybody with diabetes. I would think, honestly, everybody with diabetes or caring for somebody has Rage Bolus at some point. Essentially, you've gotten so frustrated by a high blood sugar or even a climb that you didn't expect that looks, those double arrows up. And you're like, I'm just going to get on top of this now. This is not bumping and nudging. This is completely like the other end of, I'm just going to take a lot of insulin and I'm going to get my blood sugar to come back down.
Right. But you end up using so much normally that you create some sort of a fall later.
Correct.
Yeah.
A pretty dramatic fall for the most part. Yes.
Yeah. So it's like taking a bucket of insulin, just being like, I can't take this anymore. Just, and it generally doesn't go well. There is, well, we'll wait till we get to it. So that's episode 352, Rage Bolus. Episode 358 is compression low and interstitial fluid. I think we started off making a compression low defining and ended up explaining what interstitial fluid is, because a compression low, if you're wearing a CGM, you've got this wire under your skin, the sensor, whatever they call it, filament, doesn't matter. It's a thing. It's under your skin.
Those are all things that they've been, those are all good words.
It's measuring your interstitial fluid. And if you...
the glucose in your interstitial fluid.
Thank you. And if you lay it right on top of the sensor, it compresses into your body. And when it does that, it pushes the interstitial fluid away from where the wire is, and therefore you get a low reading that isn't real.
Correct.
Because in that area right around the wire, there is actually less glucose.
Yes.
But there may be not in your body.
Plenty of it.
Right.
Pushed
Everywhere
away.
else.
Yes.
And on a Dexcom, at least, when it happens, you sort of teach yourself, you can almost see it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're like, oh, that's a weird break. I bet you that's a compression low. And it's not always. I mean, I would still test to be certain. But anyway, that's what a compression low is. It's a blip that comes up on your CGM out of nowhere that looks like you're falling, but really just might be that the transmitter and the sensor have been pushed into your body and displaced your interstitial fluid. Yes.
And as you brought up, you can really see a compression low pretty easily on CGM data, because it's the glucose data is tracking really smoothly. And all of a sudden it looks like things just like dropped off of a cliff.
Yeah.
And even those little pinpoint dots of glucose value will often have a disrupted area between the last one that looked like it was pretty stable and in target and the next one, which looks strangely low.
Yeah, it happens. All at once.
Oftentimes, parents will move their kid and roll them over in bed and it rights itself.
Yes.
So
I've definitely walked into Arden's room and been like, roll over, get on. And then she's like, what? I'm like, you're laying on your sensor. Oh, and then she flips over.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, I mean, listen, I would never say not to test for it. Like you should, because also a drastic drop looks like a drastic drop too. I'm just saying you can kind of start to see them after a while. Episode 360, fat and protein rise. So I guess to define that in just a moment, it would be that you're going to be diagnosed and somebody's going to tell you that you count carbs and you cover carbs with insulin and that's it. And there are free foods like cheese and meat and things like that because there's no carbs in them. Problem becomes with the protein specifically, your body digests the protein, turns it into glucose, right? Mm-hmm. So later in the process, you could see a rise from that. Fat, however, has a slightly different scenario. Can you tell people why fat?
It's more fat. It's more resistance with fat, where I think of a simple thing to think of is if somebody's like taking insulin and sitting on it and not letting it work quite as well, that's what fat does. Mm-hmm. Fat decreases your body's ability to use insulin by about 50%, give or take. And so, I mean, there are multiple ways of attacking coverage and all of that. When are you going to start to see fat impact? It's usually 2 to 3 hours after a meal, mm-hmm. and it will last a long time. Whereas protein starts to impact blood sugar somewhere 1 to 3 hours after a meal. If it's a large quantity or you've had a small carb containing meal with a fair amount of protein or a large amount of protein, then you may need to actually cover protein. So this isn't, you're always going to have to bolus or cover fat and protein. That's not really the truth. But there are some specific scenarios in which you would have to cover both of them or just remain high.
Right. There are multiple episodes throughout the podcast that go deep into how to bolus for fat and protein. Episode 378, Dawn Phenomenon. I might have to really get you to lean in on the technicalities of the next three, really. So,
really?
Yeah, because I know what the Dawn Phenomenon is. Like, I know that there's this time around, ready, you're testing me, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, right? Where your body kind of gives off some glucagon from your liver, something from your liver. Is that right? Or
it's also kind of the beginning of like a cortisol sort of, I mean, and 2 o'clock early, most people it's somewhere between 3 and 8 a.m. I mean, for like the widest swath of time potential, right? I mean, and there are multiple thoughts for why do some people see it more considerably than others, but most people who have tested will definitely find that as they get through and into sort of later early morning hours, things start to kind of creep up a little bit. And it may also then go along with the foot on the floor, which I don't know. Did we do that one already?
Well, we're going to get to it in a second.
Oh, we're going to get that. Okay. All right. So yeah, dawn phenomenon is really that early morning, has nothing to do with getting out of bed. Mm-hmm. It's the body's need for a little bit more insulin based on your body's preparation for you getting up to get going in the beginning of the day.
Okay. Then 379 is smogy effect. Smogy? You always say it differently than I say it. Say it.
I always say smogy effect too.
And that
some people say smogy. Yes.
All I know is I don't know what it is. We've done an episode about it and I have no recall on it whatsoever.
Yeah, well, I think actually it was really kind of funny in that episode. We actually looked up where the name came from.
It was a doctor, right?
It's a doctor, yeah. So Smogy effect or phenomenon or whatever is really when your blood sugar gets too low overnight, specifically. You get this dump of like glucose, or not really glucose, but your body starts to break down its stores of glucose, sends it into the bloodstream. It's a it's a good effect that's supposed to save you from the low, right?
Mhm.
But on the opposite of it, the trigger of those hormones can then send your blood sugars rebounding high
Okay.
later on. With a CGM, and thankfully many people have the option to use a CGM now, we can really catch, is the high blood sugar you're waking up with in the morning because you've had lows overnight?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it really because nothing low happened and you really just need more insulin put in from probably basal?
That's really interesting that the advent of a CGM takes away that I don't know what's happening idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. And then episode 380 is feet on the floor. So the way I see it with Arden is she can be super stable, right? Like 80 overnight. And her alarm starts to go off. Arden's a let the alarm go off 16 times kind of person, right? And then
she's got snooze.
She's snoozing herself. She's snoozing herself into reality. And so as she's snoozing herself into reality, I begin to see her blood sugar pick up. And then she, just a little bit, 80, 82, 85, over like 30 minutes, right? And then she wakes up and her feet hit the floor. And I believe that what happens is your brain and your body start preparing yourself for the task ahead. And I guess that's adrenaline and some other things. And then you just start seeing a rise. And then the problem ends up being is how it gets caught up in everyday life. Like, because breakfast can sometimes be difficult for people to bolus for. And on top of that, they have a rising blood sugar, perhaps from feet on the floor, that they haven't covered with basal. And anyway, that's feet on the floor. Am I right?
Yes.
I got it.
It's, you got it. It's typically noticed right upon getting out of bed specifically, especially if you've kind of curtailed the dawn phenomenon. You may actually find a secondary need to add some extra insulin as soon as you actually get out of bed.
Yeah.
And that, for the most part, isn't really well covered with a basal change. It's much better covered with a bolus to accommodate for what you know is going to happen.
Go check out the episode. I think this is a good time, Jenny, for us to just interject for 12 seconds and say to newly diagnosed people, I know this seems overwhelming, but these things will just sort of, like, you can go listen to these defining episodes, get a firm idea of what these things are. You're not going to remember every one of them right away. And eventually, as crazy as it sounds, all these things that I've listed here so far, my brain just does the processing on all of this in the background. Like, I don't stand in a situation where my daughter's blood sugar, randomly jumps up and down and think, I wonder if she's brittle. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it just,
right.
You just start of, when I see a drifting blood sugar nowhere near a bolus, I don't think, oh, we're feeding the insulin. I just think, oh, the basal looks heavy. And so, eventually it does it begins to just make sense without you having to think about it. So episode 408, insulin sensitivity factor, which people could see in their devices as IS or ISF, right?
Or even correction factor, CF.
Or CF, right? In general, look at me, I'm on a roll here. The Jenny's like, why am I here if you're not going to give me insulin sensitivity factor? It's because I don't want to do it. I don't want to do the next one. That's why, Jenny. So
I'll just make little comments along the way. That's all right.
So 1 unit of insulin moves your blood sugar blank amount of points. That's your
Correct.
Insulin sensitivity factor, or your correction factor, depending on how it's written in your pump or algorithm. That's it, right?
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. It's the way that 1 unit of insulin will navigate your blood sugar down.
So if your insulin sensitivity factor is 50 and your blood sugar is 120, giving yourself a unit should get you to 70.
Correct.
In theory. There are a lot of other variables that would stop that. And if you're just listening first and you're not going to get a chance to get to that episode, I do want to throw in here, as your blood sugar gets higher, that may become less effective. So it's possible that a 120 will move to 70 on a unit in that example, but not probable that a 250 would go to 200 with the same unit of insulin. Does that?
Yeah, and most people who watch and pay kind of enough attention when they're starting to try to figure things out more, they will notice it really works. It really works. And then all of a sudden they've got a bad site, or they've got, a missed dose of insulin, their blood sugar climbs. What I find, it's usually above, like, 220 to 250, above that, it seems to take a little bit more insulin than what your correction factor or sensitivity factor would calculate your correction dose to be.
Okay. Will you tell people what episode 415 is?
415, adrenaline highs. Oh, well, adrenaline's a fancy hormone that kind of goes right along with fight or flight, right? So what does your body do? Your body stimulates with adrenaline to really give you this rev up. I mean, your heart rate increases, your body is just in this ready state. Well, what ends up happening? Adrenaline spikes your blood sugar. For most people. Now, whether or not you actually have to correct that adrenaline spike is another thing to pay attention to.
Right. A
lot of people see these adrenaline spikes around like your A game, like the coolest team that you're going to play against, this coming weekend, and you get this spike up in blood sugar that you've not ever really seen before. Very likely it's adrenaline, or just excitement. I know that before, when I first started doing some of my initial like races, which were not very long, they were like 10Ks, but it was exciting. And I'd get there with this nice, smooth, like blood sugar. And then like 10 minutes before the gun was going to go off, I get this crazy quick kick up. Really? What's going on? Right. So
I think also go listen to that episode seriously, because there are also situations that you can't imagine yet where it might not happen. For instance,
correct.
A baseball game might make your kid excited, but baseball practice might not. And also, adrenaline needs insulin most of the time, but when adrenaline leaves and insulin remains behind, that's a situation. So adrenaline holds up your blood sugar really well when it's there. When the adrenaline goes away out of nowhere, if you've bolused for it, that insulin's still active and the adrenaline's gone now. It's almost like an unseen hand reached into your stomach and snatched your lunch out, and it just isn't there anymore to combat the insulin. Episode 415. I realize now I'm going to have to edit out every time I went before every one of these numbers. Or now I'll just leave it in. Who cares? Adrenaline highs we just did. Now the next one, episode 423, insulin deficit. Do you remember? Did we put this in to sort of give a description to people of why their blood sugars kind of drift up? I almost don't remember making this one for some reason.
I believe so. I wonder if the other one was this. Oh no, because black holes is
it's down farther. Well, let's just define insulin deficit then.
Sure.
Just probably a
4-minute insulin deficit is missing insulin, and the result is typically that your blood sugar is going to go up. That's it.
Right. We probably stuck it in there because you'll hear me say throughout the podcast, if your blood sugar is high, you probably didn't use enough insulin. And if it's low, probably used too much insulin. So, it's a good place to start. So insulin deficit is just what it sounds like. Growth hormones, episode 426. I mean, the reason we define that around diabetes is because when your kid goes to sleep at night and is inundated with growth hormones, their blood sugar is going to go up. So I don't know that growth hormones needs a description here from us, but it does need us. I think it does ask us to tell you to go to listen about it, because it's really important and it is going to impact your use of insulin.
Especially, and in all ages, I think most specifically for those who have kids with type 1, teens with type 1, women who have not quite figured out their monthly cycle yet around their hormones that go up and down. So it's definitely an important one to understand.
Yeah. Okay. Stacking insulin is episode 440. And it is very likely that you are going to be diagnosed and a doctor is going to look at you very sternly in the face and tell you, never stack insulin, right? Happens.
Without much explanation.
Right. They're just going to say it.
Right.
Don't stack insulin.
Yes.
Stacking insulin is the idea of you just sort of layering new boluses on top of each other blindly. Because it's almost rage bolusing in steps. Does that make sense? Like instead of throwing in 5 units all at once, it's a unit, then a unit, and then a unit, and a unit. And you just keep stacking them up on each other. It's
correct.
Kind of the same idea. I've never thought of it that way before until just now. But here's the thing. You really don't want to stack insulin. You want to bolus correctly for what you're eating or for the correction you're trying to make. But it's not stacking if you need it. So if your insulin is well proportioned and your understanding of covering your foods is good, and you eat at 3 o'clock and at 3:25 go, I'm going to have another serving of that. That's not stacking.
No.
That's bolusing.
Correct.
And the problem is that when your first week of blood sugars and people say, don't stack insulin, a lot of people hear it as don't use insulin frequently. Do you agree with that?
Right.
Yeah.
And I've also heard it in terms of the comment about don't stack insulin. Many will be given sort of a timeline of use of insulin. Like if you take insulin here, don't take insulin for another 3 or 4 hours. Right. But that lacks a lot of good explanation, as you just tried to do. You know, if you or your child eats lunch now and then you decide, well, I'm still hungry, or he or she is still hungry and they really want something more, there's a reason to take more, even if it's within an hour of having just bolus for other food.
Right.
If you're eating again, you need to take more insulin for that.
Yeah.
That's not stacking.
Right.
If you take insulin for a meal, blood sugar is rising, and you think, well, I'm just going to give more insulin because my blood sugar is rising. You could potentially get into stacking insulin because you really haven't seen the true impact of that. Let's call it a 3 to 4 hour active insulin window of the first bolus.
Right. Or you could just be right. You might have miscounted carbs, or the glycemic index or load might be wrong. Here's what I'm going to say. Listen to this episode because it's important, but these episodes should probably at some point lead you into the Diabetes Pro Tip series, which will make all of these definitions make a lot more sense. Episode 442, hydration. I think we all know what hydration is, so I don't know that it needs to be explained here, but you should go check out the episode because hydration has a huge impact on how insulin works. That's why it's in the definitions.
Insulin, movement of any nutrients around your body. It also impacts CGM accuracy
Significantly.
So absolutely listen to hydration.
Yeah. 455, LADA diabetes. Latent autoimmune diabetes in adults.
Yes.
Yay, look how I learned. If you guys could just see Jenny looking at me right now going, he's not going to get this.
I was like, I know we've done this so many times.
People say it to me
you know this
constantly. And it's, you know what the problem is where it breaks my brain is that it's latent autoimmune diabetes, LAD, but then it goes in adults and there's no I there. It messes me up.
Yes. I mean, really right? It's just a slow progressing form of autoimmune diabetes, or a slow progressing form of type 1 for the most part.
Which you mainly see in adults.
Correct. Right. Exactly.
Then we have MODY diabetes, which I'm going to admit I couldn't define if my life depended on it, which I'm sure you're disappointed in right now, but can you please do it?
MODY diabetes. Yes. Maturity onset diabetes of the young.
There you go. So is it LADA for young people? Ish?
Not really.
Okay.
It's definitely different than LADA. And MODY has many different, it's genetic. MODY has many different types of MODY, if you will. That's the easiest way to say it. And getting the proper diagnosis of your type of MODY becomes really important for getting the right type of medication and management strategy. So
it's one of those things that often if you have it, you're not going to know right away because doctors are going to have trouble figuring it out too.
Yes.
Which is why it's there specifically. Episode 463, Crush It and Catch It. That is a thing I made up. So it is. And you really don't start with Crush It and Catch It, right? Like listen to these, listen to the pro tips, then come back to that one maybe. But to define it, it's the idea that sometimes you have a high blood sugar that is so high. And if you have a CGM, I sort of just learned how to crush it with insulin and then catch it so that it comes in for a smooth landing without creating a high later and without getting low. Anyway, it's not a day one idea.
No.
460. Jenny's like, no, I'm not even saying anything about this.
I made no comments there whatsoever. Well, the comment I was going to say is actually, it kind of goes a little bit along with rage bolusing, but crush it and catch it means that you really are, you're not anger bolusing. You're like, I see the problem happening. You're taking emotion out of it. I'm going to do this, but I'm really going to be diligent about paying attention, and I'm going to catch it later because I know that this is likely more than I needed.
It's an aggressive, thoughtful move. It is.
Yeah.
And again, don't do it on the first day. 466, C-peptide and beta cells. C-peptide, what is that?
So C-peptide is a substance. It's made by the pancreas along with insulin. They're sort of both parts of a big molecule, right? Mm-hmm. And when insulin gets released into circulation, the C-peptide kind of gets cleaved or broken off, if you will. And it's kind of C-shaped from what I understand. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't do anything. The insulin is the piece of that molecule that we want, but C-peptide is measurable in the bloodstream. So when you're diagnosed with autoimmune diabetes or type 1 diabetes, C-peptide levels can be tested to see that they lie below what would be expected to be normal pancreatic output of insulin. Mm-hmm. And the C-peptide then shows what's actually coming out of the beta cells in the pancreas. If they're low or under a value, then usually, it goes right along with a type 1 diagnosis, along with antibody testing and that kind of stuff. Right. But C-peptides can be measured in somebody who has type 1 and has had type 1 a long time as well. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people ask, well, I take insulin, I inject it, I pump it. Isn't that going to mess the test up? Not at all. Because C-peptide is really only something that comes with your own beta cells, that molecule that's made along with insulin. It's only coming from that. Yeah. It doesn't come from our formulated insulin.
But you're going to hear the word around because people are going to say, after you're newly diagnosed, and sometimes people are like, I'm not sure if I have diabetes. Someone's going to say to you, well, have you had a C-peptide test? And that's, to pretty much tell you if you have type 1 diabetes.
Right.
And a lot of times the reason that comes up is a lot of times type 2s can be misdiagnosed or type 1s can be misdiagnosed as vice versa. That test breaks down. We also hit beta cell in there. Beta cell is the cell in your pancreas that makes insulin, and you can go learn more about it in 466.
Yes.
Episode 648, Insulin on Board. So just to define it, it's let's see, your pumps, your algorithms. InPen, for example, a smart insulin pen will tell you based on your settings how much insulin you have active in your system. The insulin on board, you being bored, and it's on you. It's a weird thing, isn't it? On board, it's such a commonly used phrase in diabetes, and yet it's not actually specific to human beings if you think of it outside of this. Not the point. Anyway, insulin on board is how much insulin you have active in your body as measured by your device, and it's based on your settings. Learn more about it in there, because if your settings are different, your insulin on board might look different. And
correct. And that one setting is your duration of insulin action or your active insulin time. That's really where insulin on board, anything your system is telling you about an amount, it's coming from a setting that you set or that your doctor recommended that you set.
Right. If you switch to a pump, you may remember your pump training when it came up on it and it says, what's my insulin action time? And the nurse went, I put 3 or 4 hours in there. and they're just like, because they don't know, and you never get told to go back to it, but you should. And you should understand it better. I just had to throw away a phone call from my mother, who calls always at the worst times. I think she has a camera in my bathroom and knows when I step into the shower. I'm pretty certain of that. Episode 652 is pump break. Some people use insulin pumps and take a break sometimes. That one's pretty self-explanatory. Episode 656, Jenny, we're going to get through this whole list.
Yay.
Episode 656 is about barriers. So I don't use barriers. Arden doesn't use them, I should say, but a lot of people do. Jenny, could you highlight a couple of them?
Barriers essentially are for people who have irritation to any or potentially all of the adhesives that are used to put a product onto the body, whether it's a CGM of any kind, a pump infusion set, or Omnipod, the infusion or the adhesive around the pod. It's essentially a way to create a barrier between the skin and the adhesive of that product. Some of the barriers are a spray, or something like Flonase, let's say, or like a spray Benadryl or something, enough to create a little bit of a barrier to prevent irritation from the adhesive. Other barriers, though, are another sticky sort of tape, if you will, type of product that you would put onto your clean skin. And then you would put your product on top of that to prevent that adhesive from causing a problem for you.
And the truth is, some people have trouble with things sticking. Some people have trouble with irritation. Some people aren't bothered by it at all. And you'll find out who you are. And then that'd be a great episode for you to listen to.
Yep.
All right. Episode 660. Oh, the next two, actually, I made up. Episode 660. Jenny's going to get to finish strong with the rest of them. It's called Black Holes. And so it is a look into how my brain thinks about creating deficits of insulin in the future. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay.
Yes.
So again, that might not be day one, but it is an episode that a number of people reached out and said, you talk about black holes in the episode, but you've never defined it. I was like, well, I will make a defining episode about it for you. Much the same as episode 664, Dictate the Pace, it's just a look at how I think about diabetes, really, where I think you should sort of be out in front of it, strike first, however you want to put it. I don't think you should cover up and let diabetes happen to you. I think you should happen to it so that the next thing that happens is quantifiable. Instead of, oh, diabetes happened, this happened, my blood sugar went up, it went down, I don't know why. I like saying I bolused and then I got low. And at least I know now I can change that bolus. I see I did something and then something else happened.
Correct.
664, Dictate the Pace. Okay, Jenny, 668 for you, carb absorption and digestion.
Yeah. So we're taught a lot about carbs initially, or you'll be taught a lot about carbs initially. The simpler the carb, the faster the impact on blood sugar. And then what you eat with that type of carbohydrate could also lead to a shift in how your body digests or processes that food to make it visible in blood sugar effect, right? So simple food being something like a big bowl of green grapes versus a big bowl of kale chips. They both have carbohydrates in them, but they're both going to absorb differently. You're going to digest them a little bit differently, so to speak, right? It's not like your body changes how it digests, but because one is simple, pretty simple carb, you're going to get much more rapid impact from some foods than from others.
Right.
The
carb absorption and digestion impacts the timing of the insulin, sometimes the amount of the insulin. It's important to understand what it is and how it works. Do another one, Jenny. 672, antibody.
Antibodies. So antibodies in general are just a protein in your blood that's essentially produced to counter a specific bad guy that's come into your body, right? Like an alien, a foreign substance, something that's not supposed to be there, right? But when we take that into diabetes specifically, for some reason, especially for type 1 autoimmune diabetes, you will have your body respond, unfortunately, in the wrong way with a destruction of the beta cells.
Yeah.
But there will be antibodies that show whether you've had an autoimmune response, and that's the reason, or you won't have antibodies. So it's a marker in the blood, essentially, that will tell you.
And it's generally possible now that you have an autoimmune disease that you might see others, and antibodies are going to be words that come up again if you end up with something like hypothyroidism or celiac or something to that effect. And speaking of hypo, episode 677, hypo and hyper, just defines hypo and hyper. Hypo, low, hyper, high. Still feel like you should go listen to the episode.
And glycemia, because they are together, right? With hyperglycemia. Glycemia is just glucose.
We sort of go through the words or the prefixes, and you could see how, like, you can have hypoglycemia. You can also have hypothyroidism. You can have hyperglycemia, hyperthyroidism, etc. It's interesting. Jenny and we're delightful as we record these, so you should definitely listen to it no matter what. And so far, on June 13th, 2022, the last episode of Defining Diabetes is episode 681, where we just go over all of the different types of diabetes. You heard a couple of them here in this list. Yeah, we we
really dove in.
we found all the diabetes, not just LADA and Moody and type 1 and type 2, but there's other stuff, and it's interesting. As you can see, Jenny, as we wrap up this episode, you and I started making these Defining Diabetes episodes at episode 263, bolus. I'm going to look just real quickly, if you'll indulge me for a second.
Of course.
I can look very quickly and see. 236, excuse me. Episode 236, which was Defining Diabetes bolus. It was the first one. June 21st, 2019. That is 9 days shy of 3 years ago.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? Am I wrong? 2020, 21? No, I'm right. Look at me.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the same level of sad excitement as when I knew what LADA meant. And everyone listening is like, the guy with the podcast wasn't 100% sure what LADA meant? Yeah. I can't know everything.
Oh, no, you knew what it meant. It was just the words to know what the actual acronym was, right?
You're very
Not
kind.
that you didn't know. You have to give yourself more credit.
Jenny, you're defending me like my grandmother. Thank you very much. Leave Scott alone. He knows.
Only because I like you.
Thank you. But I mean, the point is that when we started it on 236, did you really think we would have done another one last month?
I don't know. I didn't know how many. You're like, we're just going to keep getting ideas, and then we're just going to keep doing this. And I was like, that's great. I like doing this.
But 681 types of diabetes we recorded in May of 2022. I'm just saying.
That's a long time.
It's a long time, and expect the list to grow, because I think Jenny and I both completely agree that management of diabetes is, at first, it's understanding. It's understanding that you have tools, and these tools are sometimes thrown around as words that you don't know. And you can't possibly, you know what I mean? Like, if the word ketone never came up in your life, and then all of a sudden someone's like, you have diabetes, and by the way, ketones are bad, you don't want to go into DKA. You're like, oh my God, like,
right.
What? And, so the way I liken it in my mind is, you can have a screw and a screwdriver. If you don't know what a screwdriver is, it might not help you. So learn these definitions, and hopefully one day when someone shows you a screw, you'll be like, oh, I know what to do. And you'll reach in your pocket and pull out your screwdriver and just whip it right into the board, and you'll be on your way. And I think these go a long way towards doing that. I also think they go a long way towards preparing you to listen to the Pro Tip series. So, and Jenny, if, you just heard her say a second ago, she enjoys doing this.
I do.
And I know you do. She loves helping people with diabetes. And I'm very proud that you're involved in these. I don't tell you this stuff often on the podcast, so let me just do it now. I'm looking at her, so it's embarrassing. But these definitions and, the Pro Tip series, like, I know I'm the one who said, like, let's do this and let's do this. But let's be honest, without you, they're not what they are. So
thank you.
I would clap, but it's a podcast and it's meaningless. But people would just be like, great, now there's noise while I'm listening. But yeah, you've just been and continue to be such an asset to people with type 1. And
thank you.
I feel
and I'm glad that you've started something that's grown into such a community of support for people. And that's the reason that I enjoy continuing to help you to put good information. I think that word good is really important, because there's a lot of misinformation. I'm not going to call it bad information, but I think especially in doing these definitions, it's really important for people to understand what things mean, words they might have heard, and they may be too embarrassed or too overwhelmed to ask, well, what does that mean? I don't get it. Can you explain that differently to me? And that's really, really important for you to live better.
Yeah. I want to say that part of the value and kind of why I brought up how long it's been since we did the first one. And by the way, 236 was still 236 episodes into the podcast. It's years into the podcast. It's because I saw someone online the other day. I don't want to say they were ripping me off, but let's say they were, okay? They were doing their own defining thing. And I never listened to other people's stuff, but I thought, let me just see for a minute. And I looked, and this person hadn't been involved with diabetes for very long. They hadn't been making their content very long. And then they did a haphazard job of explaining the thing. It's still, I think, for their level of understanding, I think they did a great job. But there's something to be said for you with 30 plus years of living with diabetes, plus you're a CDE, plus you talk to people literally all day long, every day of the week about type 1. And me, who's been making this podcast forever, besides doctors, I don't know, there's nobody who talks to people with diabetes more than I do, I don't think, right? I record 6-7 hours of conversations every week. Right. And there's something about knowing, like being able to say something with confidence and put it into context, which you do for me all the time, because I'll say things and you'll come around and be like, yes, in this specific situation, this is exactly what you just said. But don't forget about this aspect of it, which is not how my brain works. And so there's something between all of the experience, all of your training, my ability to tell a story, your ability to keep me honest, like it all just, it's why it's good information, I think.
Right.
That's
well, and I think because you also have a lot of pieces that people can go to specifically. And in many, I've heard you say in many of the episodes or many of the ones that I've listened to myself, you'll say, if you want more about this, go here. We've explained this a little bit better, or this whole episode is all about this. It's not just something that's brought up and then
it's gone. There's nowhere
it leaves
else
the person hanging and they're listening to the rest of the conversation, but really they wanted that little nugget that you kind of just accidentally brought up. They wanted that. And that's a really big piece of tying something that's very beneficial, like in terms of education, together.
Right. You
have to be able to send somebody to the right place for exactly what they want.
We've been able to do this for so long. And I really sincerely mean the sponsors like kept this podcast going and keep it going, but we've been able to do it so long that it's now a compendium of information, not just an episode about what honeymoon means.
Right.
You know, and I just got a note. I know you have to go. I just got a note from a woman online the other day. She said, I just finished the last episode of the podcast. She listened from 1 to at this point, she listened to 698, right? Like straight through, and then showed a graph and talked about her A1C and her success. And she said, I listened to this podcast straight through and look at my blood sugar. And you know, it's because of this. So if you want it's in here.
That's like almost a month worth of like that's 24-hour day after 24-hour day. That's 28 straight days of 24 hours. Assuming I know some of the episodes aren't quite an hour and some are longer than an hour, but in general, that's 28 days of not stopping listening.
Yeah.
That's a lot of listening.
That's a person I don't think you or I could sneak up behind on the street and talk and they wouldn't just spin around and go, oh my God, Jenny's here. So anyway, my point in saying that is the information you need to live with insulin is inside this podcast. If you go get it, I think that's great. If you jump around, I understand. But I mean, listen to these defining episodes before you go to the pro tip series. I really actually think that's important. So
agreed.
Anyway, thank you very much, Jenny, for doing this.
Yeah, you're very well. Thank you for asking me and continuing to have me.
Who else would I ask? Stop it. You're making me embarrassed. A huge thanks to InPen from Medtronic Diabetes for sponsoring this episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Head over now to inpentoday.com to get started. And while you're doing that, make sure you've heard episode 711, which is the first part of this conversation. Hope you're enjoying the Bold Beginning series. If you are, go look for other episodes that you think you might also enjoy. Jenny Smith works at integrateddiabetes.com in case you want to hire her. And I'm going to leave you a little bit of information after the music about how you can find out more about the podcast, subscribe, and other such things. All right, some quick stuff you'll want to know. The private Facebook group now has 26,000 people in it. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes. People using insulin. You can hang out, watch what they're saying, talk, ask questions, pick brains, or just lurk. Whatever you need, it's there. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes, including lists like the Bold Beginning series, Defining Diabetes, the Diabetes Pro Tip episodes, Diabetes Variables, all listed in the feature section of the Facebook page. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes. It's a private group, so you'll have to answer just a few questions so that we know you're a real person. Everything else you need to know about the podcast can be found at juiceboxpodcast.com or diabetesprotip.com. If you're looking for a great endocrinologist, we have a list at juiceboxdocs.com. It's curated by the listeners. Doctors who are down with how people who listen to the podcast take care of their type 1. You want that part to be easy too, right? Juiceboxdocs.com. Completely free. Everything is free, by the way. Find me on Instagram. Find me on Facebook. Find me somewhere. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a beautiful rating and review in whatever app you're listening in. Like 5 stars. This is amazing. And then give a really great description so the next person who sees your review will know that it's worth listening to. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. And don't forget that episode 712, the second half of this episode, is available right now in your podcast player or at juiceboxpodcast.com.